Remind me how many folks are here in LeGrand for the first time this year around town. Awesome. So yesterday I was over at Catherine Creek State Park, which is about a half hour away and is a really nice place to, it's got a little loop that follows the river. You can picnic, you can walk and do all sorts of nice things. Last night I went there and I heard a combination of sounds, which was a bunch of wild turkey that apparently were in some of the trees. There were also crickets chirping in the evening, which was nice. And there were a whole bunch of cows that you could hear because there was just like a big ranch just a little ways away. And it's a little bit hard to make out some of the sound, but it's the wild turkey up there in the trees. Can hear a little bit of it. But when I saw that yesterday, I thought to myself, that's like the most succinct Eastern Oregon experience distilled, right? With the wildlife, the cattle, the outdoors, and some of the weird, silly stuff that you can sometimes encounter. I have learned in this last year of living here in Eastern Oregon that if there is a cow in the middle of the road, you just try to find a way to drive around it, or you can even kind of like herd it a little bit. You drive really slowly. So if you're from the city and not used to it out here, just a fun thing to have on your radar. You will likely encounter cows on the road in your coming months here. All right. So welcome back to interpersonal communication. Glad to have you back. This is our second class meeting. Before we get started on new stuff for today, is there anybody that's here for the first time? I think everybody's returning. Awesome. So last class, toward the end of class, I asked you to work on this anonymous form. It's just a survey letting me know how comfortable you feel about certain things. I did that so that I can focus on some of the areas and skills that will hopefully be helpful and useful to you. I think that there are a lot of skills that just aren't talked about a whole lot in college and that a lot of professors assume people know. So I wanted to dedicate some time in real estate toward addressing those issues. I had the chance to look over the responses on those. And there were a few different areas where it sounded like some additional support was going to be really useful. In particular, some folks mentioned navigating some of the resources on campus, like the Writing Center was an area that they wanted a bit more support in. So I'm going to be spending a bit of time today going over some of the resources that we have on campus because they're awesome, but I don't know that they're super well known. Some other things that people brought up were tips with note-taking for classes. So I'll be going over some of the ways that I would recommend taking notes for this class and some general best practices for taking notes for your college classes that'll help you to prepare. And then third, an area that people mentioned wanting some additional help with citation and writing. And we'll be dedicating a big chunk of that on next Monday. We'll be doing a bit of a mini lab and going over some tips on writing for this class and all of your classes. So again, if this is a review, if you feel pretty good about those things, there's always new things to learn. And if you find yourself needing additional support outside of what we talked about in class, you're welcome to reach out to me or reach out to some of the resources that we'll be going over. So everybody here is returning. So we had the chance to get to know each other last class. And what I'd like to do now is to refresh ourselves on what interpersonal communication is. So we talked a little bit about defining interpersonal communication last class, and I'd like to see if there's a couple folks that would like to take a stab at explaining in their own words what interpersonal communication is. Do any brave volunteers? Yes.
Expressing thoughts or ideas between two people.
Yeah. Gary, right? Yeah. So expressing thoughts or ideas between two people. Great. Is expressing thoughts or ideas through text messages interpersonal communication? What about a group text? So if you're in a group text, it's about 4 or 5 different people. Is that interpersonal communication? How many people say yes? How many people say no? So kind of split. Yeah. So building off of Gary's point, right? Interpersonal communication is focused between the exchange of messages and meaning between two people, right? And two is the key operative word here. So something like a group text with 4 or 5 people would not be considered interpersonal communication, right? It would be considered group communication. And interpersonal communication can happen face-to-face. It can happen through text message, right? It can even happen through using things like a phone call or Zoom, right? Many of the ways that we've had to connect with each other over the past couple of years. So interpersonal communication, to give you kind of the broadest definition possible, focuses on the exchange of meaningful messages between two people. So we've already gotten over the two people part, and meaningful messages is really important. That is, you are delivering a message which has some type of impact or feedback from the other person, right? So say you're a really big Taylor Swift fan and you decide you want to send this like incredibly long, heartfelt video to her expressing how much she changed your life and helped you get through a bad break. Would that be considered interpersonal communication? Seeing some shaking heads. No, it wouldn't, right? Because unless you're a very, very lucky fan, Taylor Swift is never going to respond to your message or even see your message, right? It's parasocial. It's a message that doesn't really have reciprocity. So it wouldn't be considered a meaningful exchange between two people, right? The other person has to take it in and has to respond to it, right? So how many people have ever felt like some anxiety or concern because they're like messaging somebody and they see the little bubbles that show up when somebody's about to send a message and then they open? Yeah. So a few of you, right? So interpersonal communication, it happens online, it happens through text. It's especially interesting because some of those elements, right? You use GIFs, you use emojis, all of those things shape the way that we communicate online, obviously, right? But also the meaning of those messages changes online as well. For instance, one of the generational divides that's been talked about a lot is that increasingly Gen Z and younger generations tend to use emojis ironically, right? They aren't necessarily using an emoji for the intended meaning, whereas an older person is more likely to use a message for intended meaning, right? So there are some of those dynamics. How many of you who did like Zoom or Google Office meetings or similar types of virtual meetings found yourselves getting more tired than you would expect after having those meetings? Yeah, most of you, right? That's actually a phenomenon that's been studied in communication. And what research has found is that when we are in a virtual meeting, right, if we're in a Zoom call with somebody, what do we have? We have a little rectangular box. And sometimes if we have multiple people in the meeting, we've got a ton of these different boxes, right? I mentioned last class that 80% of our communication face-to-face, thereabouts, is nonverbal, right? Our use of gestures, our use of facial expressions, our tone of voice, how we say something, that has a really big role on how we pick up on and make sense of communication with other people. When we communicate online, right, using something like Zoom, that element of nonverbal communication gets way more difficult. Our brains essentially work in overdrive to try to perceive and understand what's happening on a flat surface. The audio could be distorted or worse. People could be unable to pick up on facial expressions and cues, and you're picking up on a lot of different ones at once, where you have things like physicality and distance face-to-face that just aren't present there, right? So that's been studied a lot in the significance of face-to-face interactions, but we also get a lot of meaningful interactions that happen online too, right? The ability to communicate more, to send messages, to have pen pals or people that we contact, especially from distances, are ways that interpersonal communication happens in that online context, right? So this course is interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication is about two, and it's about how we exchange meaningful messages between those two people. The other thing, right, is the process of exchanging those messages. And that happens through the use of symbols. So we'll be talking a little bit about symbols and semiotics in a minute. So last class, we did some introductions to each other. We talked a little bit about interpersonal communication. And I talked shop a little bit about the course policies, syllabus, expectations, and all of that good stuff. I like to take a pause at the beginning of every class to see if anybody has any questions about anything that we talked about last class or anything about the course more generally at this point. Yes, Gary.
All right, I know we went over the reading assignments for week to week. I just want, and the activity at the end of the week. And for the reading assignments, I forget, when did you want those read by? Was it Wednesday or Monday?
It is Friday, right? So that's a good question. Essentially, you can think about the reading assignments as closely connected to your prompts and sort of divided into chunks by each week, right? So in other words, I'm not going to say that by Monday you need to read this, by Wednesday you need to read this, by Friday you need to read this, right? Because I know you all are juggling a lot as students, and finding the right nooks and crannies for this course can be a bit of a challenge. So basically for this week, right, we have this chunk here, wrench 37 to 52, 63 to 68. And that is due, you'll need to have read it by the end of this week, by this Friday. We'll be going over and kind of building off of the content that's talked about in the readings, right? So you'll want to work through the readings, but the content we'll be going over in class builds off of and is informed by the readings. And then the Canvas prompt that's due on Friday as well is specifically connected to the readings, right? So to give you an example, this first Canvas prompt that I'm asking you to finish for Friday is asking you to discuss the 6 different parts. We'll be going over that in a bit more detail on Friday, but it's present in your readings, right? Sender, receiver, noise, feedback, etc. We'll also be talking about, and your reading talks about perception, the perception process, right? So you'll be able to use the readings to help you to complete those Canvas prompts. Those Canvas prompts are due on Fridays.
And
yeah,
do you intend for them to be locked right now?
The first week should be available, right? It's available from Monday up until October. So typically I've staggered them by week, but some folks have noted that it's helpful to have some of the later weeks in advance. So I'll be filling in some of the later ones as well. So this week's is available. The ones past this week, I'll start to populate as the term continues. Good question. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, so I'm a little bit confused with the prompt things. Do we choose one of those or do we do all 3 of those? And then that's like a week. That we could skip 2 weeks or?
Yes. So you're working through the full prompt, right? And this prompt has 3 parts, right? So this part about interactions, this part about perception, and this part about ethical communicator. So all of those are like subparts of that prompt, right? And you can choose 6 out of the 8 prompts over the course of the term, right? So all of these fit within that prompt, and you get to choose 6. Good questions. Again, I do not require formal citations for these. These aren't like big, scary essays that you need to write. You can be a bit more informal in your writing. I just want to see that you kind of know the readings and you're working through these ideas in your responses. Got a couple questions? Yes.
About how long do you want them?
I'd say about 2 to 3 paragraphs is generally a good way to focus this, right? I think each part of the prompt would generally be about 4 or 5 sentences or so. Doesn't need to be a super long essay, but hits on those points, I think, in a concise and clear way. Using examples effectively is useful. The italicized portion is explaining kind of how I'm grading each of those parts and what your grading breakdown looks like. So a question back here? Yeah, no worries. Also, if you want to send me a draft of these in advance or want feedback in advance, you're welcome to do so as well. And also remember, right, that if you choose to submit more than the 6, then I'll grade your top 6. So if you had one where you just kind of dropped the ball or just did not do the work you wanted to do, right, you can make up for that later. All good questions. I appreciate you all really starting to think about this. So I'm glad you brought that up, Gary, because I was actually just about to mention a reminder about that prompt and about some of the expectations for that prompt. So for today, and by the way, if you have questions at any other point in the class, feel free to raise your hand, give me a holler, and let me know. If I'm working through things too quickly and need me to go back to anything, let me know as well. So I want to go over some resources available on campus that will help you to succeed in this and other courses. We'll be talking about symbols, and we'll be talking about some of the different genres and types of communication and where interpersonal communication fits in within all of this. So one thing that you all mentioned, maybe wanting some additional support with, was the process of note-taking for college courses, right? I know a lot of you are in your first year and potentially your first year of college, right? So taking notes and keeping up with your courses can be something that might be a little bit new to you at this level. So things vary a lot depending on the course and depending on expectations and assignments, right? One thing that I like to do to make things accessible and more straightforward to you is, again, I link the slides for every class before the class starts, and I keep the slides up. They don't go down at any point in the term. Right, you don't have to worry about losing that material. So given that, you don't need to write everything down word for word as we're going through slides. I find that that's not really a great way to learn if you're trying to scramble to get everything written down, right? Rather than focus on getting things written down, I encourage you to instead focus on what are the aha moments, right? The moments that really stick out to you or really make you think in a specific way that helps you as we're working through things. For example, if I start to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And you're thinking about how safety needs were something that your friend dealt with recently, and the ways that they communicated through mutual aid or support were a way to fill that need. That's awesome, right? It's a great note for yourself to take down. So I think those things are really useful. Another really foundational skill, and I think one of the things that I notice the most for folks who have some challenge with taking notes, is just to make sure that your notes are really well marked and that you're able to keep track of those, right? If you've got like a binder with some written notes and it gets all folded and all scrunched up and things aren't even marked by date, right? It's really hard to refer back to that if you're about to study for an exam. So I think that really clearly identifying the date is one thing that's really important, right? And also giving yourself a more detailed topic or headline. So don't just say interpersonal communication, you might say defining interpersonal communication and communication genres for today, right? I like to give you an overview of what we're going over that day. You can also use the topic that's listed on the schedule grid on Canvas as well. Whatever makes it easiest for you as you're reviewing for an exam, right? I wish more folks provided slides for people to access. You can always ask your instructors at other classes if they're willing to do so. You can also ask if they're comfortable with you taking screenshots of any of the slides too. Both of those things can be really helpful. Another thing is that if you have people who work through stuff really quickly, it is your teacher's responsibility to pace the class and ensure that you're understanding things. So do not be afraid to tell somebody to slow down in your courses if they're doing too quickly and you can't keep up with material. And then, one thing to know about this class for today and for classes going forward is that I take attendance through the completion of activities. Some of them will be on your own, some of them will be in partnerships, small groups, etc. Right? I encourage you, if you do notes by hand, to have a separate sheet of paper that you kind of tear out in order to do those activities. That way you're not taking away your notes when you go to turn those activities in. And then the other thing, one thing that I think is useful is the Cornell method of taking notes. It's kind of a T-chart, right, where you have the title, you have the date. On the left side here, you have some of the keywords, quotes, and big ideas, right? And then you do kind of a free-form set of notes that's just going through things that are discussed in the class. You don't have to use that format. I just thought it would be a useful one for you to know about and a good resource as you're working through. Any questions or issues about note-taking that I can address? Okay. Oh, did I see a hand up? Are we good? Gotcha. So the other thing that I wanted to let you know about are some of the resources that are available on campus, as well as online, right? I think at EOU, it's an awesome space because we have a ton of staff who are dedicated. Their entire jobs, right, are designed to help you to succeed in your courses, and help you with completing assignments, activities, and so on. So one thing that's a really cool resource that I didn't fully know about until this last week is the e-tutoring system here at EOU. So essentially the way this works is that you log in and there are a variety of online tutors for a whole bunch of different subjects, right? So communication is on there and just about every class should be available as well. And you can set up a meeting through Zoom and do kind of a live tutoring with them. You can also do an e-question where you can ask the tutor a specific question. So say you're struggling in a math class and you know, you're having some challenges using PEMDAS to properly solve equations, right? You can ask questions related to that. And the really cool thing is that live tutoring, you'll typically get somebody in contact with you within hours. So it's really cool to have that level of quick, efficient communication with them. If you find yourself interested in tutoring and becoming a tutor, right? That's also an opportunity available at EOU. It's a great career builder. And you can get in touch with the tutoring center or get in touch with me if that's something that you're interested in doing. So there's this tutoring that's available. There's also tutoring that's available face-to-face. There's also the writing lab, which 24 to 48 hours in advance will let you send them a writing assignment, and they will give you some feedback on that assignment. The EOU Writing Center is located over in Loso Hall. It's just down the hall in room 234. So there's the opportunity to meet with a writing tutor as discussed. But if you'd rather not meet with a person specifically and just want some pointers to help you with your writing for this and other courses, I really recommend checking out this student resources page. This page is awesome because it's got a whole bunch of different things, including how to organize, how to develop thesis statements, tips about editing. If you or somebody you know is an English as a second language student, right, there's opportunities for that as well. So how to write a strong thesis, right? There's some really great resources on how to do all of these types of things. And if you're having trouble accessing the links, they are in today's slides. So you're welcome to go back and play around with these. So there's the Writing Center resources. There's also the Learning Center, which has a computer lab space. Disability services, if you need accommodations, is available as well. And the English and writing program within our college has a lot of resources to help too. So really great things that we have on our campus and online that are designed to support you. Are folks feeling like they have a better sense of some of the things available on campus? Awesome. Again, I think it's really cool, but I don't know that it's super well advertised. So I like to make a plug for some of these. And again, right, I mentioned on Monday, right, think about it like a small fire in your home, right? You've got a fire, you put it out. The sooner you can reach out to some of these resources, the better. If you find yourself struggling, because oftentimes they will get swamped toward the end of the term. They still want to help you, but sometimes it's harder for them to reach back out. All right. So I want us to zoom out just a little bit and think more generally about what communication is. So we know that interpersonal communication is meaningful exchange of information between two people, right? If we were to think about this as broadly as possible, what is communication?
The exchange of information.
Okay. The exchange of information. Is there anything we can add to that? How do we exchange information?
Through symbols, whether that's spoken or shown.
Right? Communication is the use of symbols to convey shared meaning. So I'm going to be breaking down both of these parts because I think they're both really important to breaking down what communication is, right? So we talked a little bit about this idea of a symbol, right? The word dog is a symbol. It's a series of letters, it has a sound to it, right? And it is symbolizing or standing in for a four-legged creature, right? Shared meaning refers to the idea that both you and the other person that you're talking to speak the language, understand what you're talking about, and so forth, right? So if you were to say, I saw a dog the other day, based on that other person's meaning and significance that they have to the word dog, they might think some really different things. For instance, maybe you're like a good friend of mine who grew up in a family with a bunch of tiny Shih Tzus and hears the word dog and thinks about all of them yapping and running around. Maybe you're like me and you think about a terrier that bit me when I was 5 years old, left a scar on my face. It's fine, I still love dogs, right? Depending on your lived experience, your sense of meaning is going to be different. How many of you have traveled to another country that does not primarily speak the language that you speak? Okay, so a couple of you, right? That experience of culture shock, right, and of being in a very different culture and background has a really big impact on us. We cannot create shared meaning because we don't speak the same language. We're reliant on other cues and that sort of thing, right? I went to Paris for a conference last year, and in that process, I was trying to get my bearings, use Duolingo to try to learn language. But I found myself like going to a store and just like pointing at things that I wanted, like at a bakery to tell them, right? It becomes challenging when you don't have that same shared meaning through language or through jargon or more technical or context-specific language, right? Pictured here at the top is Roland Barthes. Barthes was the founder and really kind of influential figure in developing semiotics. Semiotics refers to the study of signs, right? The study of symbols, their meaning, and how we transmit that meaning between different people. One thing that I find is especially interesting is that there is a group of indigenous people in the Amazon River area. And this population is what's considered to be anumeric. That is, they have numbers to describe 1 stick, 2 stick, 3 sticks, but beyond that, they only say several sticks. So they did a study in which a bundle of sticks was presented, and people were asked which bundle of sticks is bigger. One had 7, one had 8, and that population did not identify a difference between the two, right? Communication and language shapes reality. How we develop those symbols and use those symbols in our lives helps us to make sense of our experience. The fact that we're even thinking using words is a testament to how communication is shaping the way that we look at the world. And, right, the way that we use symbols to communicate can look really different across different cultures and populations. There are a variety of folks with disabilities, for instance, who are nonverbal, but nevertheless find ways to communicate. American Sign Language, or ASL, right, is spoken using gestures, and it's still considered a language, still considered interpersonal communication. So, according to Barthes, communication has what's known as a signifier and signifier, right? The signifier is not the thing. The signifier is a representation or stand-in for the thing using language. So, for instance, maybe it's a laughing emoji. It is signifying that you might be laughing, right? Or based on devaluing of emojis over the years, somebody sends you a whole line of laughing emojis and they just like smiled. They didn't even laugh, right? But ideally, there is a relationship between what the symbol is and the experience that the symbol is trying to share, right? So to go back to my earlier example, right? The generational divide of people using emojis in a way that's more ironic and not necessarily meant to convey the symbol itself would be an example of a disconnect in shared meaning, right? If you have an older grandparent or relative who like sends a bunch of minion gifs and memes, right? And you're sending them ironically to be silly and make fun of people, right? That'd be a difference in the development of shared meaning. We communicate with each other to fulfill needs, right? We are social people. We are tied to other people to make sure that our needs get met. These needs can be physical, social, and personal. How many folks have ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? A couple of you, right? I've seen a variation of this where at the very bottom, there's like an extra row added to the pyramid that just says Wi-Fi. I think that's pretty good. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, says that in order to get up here, we've got to have the base, right? We've got to build the bottom layers of the pyramid. How do we do that? Well, we use communication, right? So here at the bottom, we have what are known as physiological needs. If you are incredibly hungry, if you have not gotten enough sleep, that is very likely going to implicate your ability to take notes in classes, to follow along if you're talking to a friend, etc. You've got to have that basic physiological need met. Above that, we have safety, right? Think about this in terms of short-term versus long-term. Okay, I have food, right? Going back to our lizard brains, who were trying to secure, territory and land, right? How do we ensure that I'm able to have what I need in a longer-term process, right? It's kind of like in the beginning of COVID, when things got really weird and everybody started hoarding toilet paper and you couldn't buy toilet paper at the store, right? Those were people perhaps overcompensating on trying to fulfill safety needs. Then we have love and belonging, right? We want to feel socially connected to other people, friendship, family, sexual intimacy. All of those things are things that we closely associate with our survival and well-being, and also the idea of being well-rounded humans. We also have what's known as esteem, right? Self-esteem refers to the value judgment that you make about yourself. Am I a good person? Do people like me, etc.? Your confidence and self-achievement, respect of others, etc., right? Is this feeling that you belong and you are a part of communities and groups with whom you will be able to have some of those baseline needs met, right? At the very top, we have self-actualization. That's being the very best version of yourself. That's doing the things that make you happy, right? That's pursuing your dreams and your opportunities. And Maslow's hierarchy says, get up there, you got to do these other things below it. How do we do those things? Well, we communicate, right? So that's why interpersonal communication matters in that way. Additionally, studies say that we feel happier when we communicate and when we communicate effectively. People who felt major isolation over the last 2.5 years can definitely speak to the experience that communication improves us, right? And we also like the idea that we can feel heard, that we can feel understood. There's nothing worse than the feeling that we're talking to somebody and it doesn't seem like they're listening to us, and we're not taking their needs seriously, and our brains get into a fight or flight mode, especially if those needs aren't being taken seriously at a very base level, at a physiological level, right? If you and a friend are driving, you say, I really need to go to the bathroom, and they just are ignoring you and aren't listening, right? That's a very big problem for you, and that might turn out to be a very big problem for them too. So understanding these needs and how we communicate them is important. As mentioned, right, a symbol is not the thing. The symbol, right, or the use of language to convey a thought or an idea is not the same, right? I'm not a magician. I don't get to say apple and then magically conjure up this round object, right? But in saying it, I get you thinking about it. It's the same way that somebody tells you don't think of an elephant. Well, I'm pretty sure you just thought of an elephant, right? Thinking of a thing, using language to convey a thing, makes that mental picture show up in our heads. Depending on our lived experience, it could be a Granny Smith, it could be a Fuji, it could be a Honeycrisp, right? What we think of as an apple is based on our lived experience. So to give you an example, right? If I were to say that I went to the Apple store today, depending on our shared meaning, that could mean a couple different things. Does that mean that I went to Apple, the computer company, in order to buy a new charger and upgrade my phone plan, right? Or does it mean that I went to a local store in order to purchase an apple, right? We use language within the sentence and we use context clues in order to make sense of that sentence. I went to the Apple store, right? You know the company, you know that it's oftentimes referred to as the Apple store, right? But if you were in a location that didn't have an Apple store, or if you were talking to somebody who didn't even know what Apple as a company was, they might think that you were mentioning the fruit, right? Or you could be mentioning a fruit, and maybe you were getting some fresh produce. Either way, shared meaning matters. As we'll be talking about on Friday, right? Noise is what distorts the message and distorts our sense of shared meaning. There's something lost in translation And what you intend, right? I'm going to the Apple store, you mean to go get technology, might be read in a different way by somebody else. I'm going to get produce. Could mean very different things and could fulfill very different needs. I wanted to show you a super short clip that talks a little bit more about semiotics and gives you a visual way of thinking about it.
This blob is eating dinner. This blob is sleepy. This blob loves you. But how do we know that? This is a job for semiotics, the field of study that explores how humans and other organisms derive meaning from the world around them. In semiotics, a sign is anything that represents or indicates something else, called the object. A sign isn't necessarily pictorial. For example, the feel of a fruit may indicate its ripeness, and the sound of buzzing may mean there is a bee around. Charles Sanders Peirce defined 3 categories of signs: icon, index.
So that gets a little more advanced, but the core kind of fundamental element, right, that semiotics is how we share symbols. Semiotics being sound, being touch, being words that mean a thing, right? When you see smoke, you assume that there is a fire, are examples of how we use semiotics in everyday life. So we've got another pyramid, and I promise that this class is not a pyramid scheme, but this is a pyramid of different types of or genres of communication. Again, I think it's important for us to break down these different parts to understand where this class fits in and understand some of the challenges of each of those parts. Here at the tippy top, we've got intrapersonal communication. Does anybody want to take a stab at what intrapersonal communication is? For anybody who's heard this term before?
Communication with yourself.
Yep, right. Interpersonal communication is talking to or communicating with yourself. And this happens in a couple different ways. We can do this directly. So if you're like me and you're driving to work, you do like tongue twisters to loosen up your jaw and get yourself ready for speaking, right? Could be hyping yourself in the mirror before a big game, playing along to silly music, right? But it can also be what's known as the internal dialogue, right? So if you're familiar with Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio, by the way, I've heard the new movie is terrible. I haven't seen it, but right, he is the conscience of Pinocchio. He's the person that's telling him to write along with him. And in many ways, we often feel a conscience or inner voice in our heads telling us the right or wrong thing in our lives. That's interpersonal communication. It's that voice in your head. While you might not be verbally speaking to it or talking to yourself, right? You're thinking through these issues and you're trying to decide what to do. Interpersonal communication, as we talked about, is meaningful communication between 2 people, happens through a variety of modalities. Group communication is generally between 3 and 12 people, right? Should be noted in our program, we essentially have courses that cover this whole gamut, right? Except for intra, which is something we talk about a little bit in this class. But group communication, we actually teach a small group communication class in the winter. We also teach a class on conflict management, right? So group communication involves working with a team, involves very different dynamics. You're working together with that group to solve a problem, working with a group of friends, etc., right? That's group communication. Public communication is intended for a larger audience. So one way of public communication that I like to think about is a speech. If you have a politician or candidate who is coming to give what's known as a stump speech, right? They're speaking to their constituents or voters, talking about the issues, they're doing a town hall event, or they're fielding answers to questions, etc., right? We have a mayor's race in LeGrand. There were some candidates who were speaking at some of these types of events. And lastly, we have mediated. So this is an important distinction between using media to communicate interpersonally, right? By mediated communication, in this context, we mean mass media. In other words, right, this is media that is intended for a large audience and is not catered to any specific person, right? So if you're somebody that started watching Andor on Disney Plus, right, that is an example of mediated communication. It was not made for you. It's probably made for people who liked Star Wars or liked Rogue One, right? But it wasn't intended for a specific person. It's reaching a larger group, right? The circulation of advertisements, of larger messages happens at that bottom mediated level. Again, I went over each of these. Yes.
I guess, how can you differentiate public communication between media communication? Like, let's say an interview, how is that media or public,
Yeah,
or one or the other?
yeah, that's a great question, right? That's a blurry line. I think that one of the deciding factors is whether or not media is used as the primary channel of communicating, right? So oftentimes public communication goes back to somebody speaking face to face with a group of people, but it gets circulated, right? Or a meeting might be recorded or it might be live streamed at the same time, right? These last couple of years, that line has gotten blurrier and blurrier. I think one big way of thinking about this difference is how a message is circulated, because mediated communication typically does not have as specific of an audience in mind, right? It's using algorithms. It's trying to throw a bunch at the wall and see what sticks, right? Whereas public communication generally has a little bit more context to go off of, right? If you're talking in front of a group of people and you start telling jokes and people start laughing, right? That helps and informs the way that you communicate. So I would say the absence of feedback is a big factor that differentiates those two as well. Good question. Again, we went over these 5 in a bit of detail. So what I'd like us to do now is a group activity for attendance for today. And I'm going to be putting you into 5 different groups. Each of these groups will be responsible for one of the 5 parts of the pyramid. And what I'd like your group to do is to think about as many situations in which this type of communication is used. Write those down or type those up for your attendance. What are some of the needs that this communication fulfills? Again, thinking back to Maslow's hierarchy. And then lastly, what are some of the challenges of this type of communication? I'm going to group you all off and give you some time to work on that. We've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. We'll have the 4 of you focus on intrapersonal communication. 1, 2, 3, 4 in the back, focus on interpersonal communication. We'll have 1, 2, and 3 focus on group communication. We'll have 1, 2, and 3 focus on public communication. And then we'll have 1, 2, and 3 in the back focus on mediated communication. Everybody know their group and where they're tasked? Sweet. So take some time to chat about it. Have somebody in your group who is jotting down some notes. And also have somebody in your group that's prepared to share in about 5 or 6 minutes.
Probably. So, or is that you should not.
All this is going to come down to confidence. What's the right one?
I heard you mention like motivations. Right? How do we figure out what we want or what we want to tell other people that we want, right? Usually that interpersonal communication is the starting point.
The music propels everybody gets hurt.
Yeah. That's a good example, right? Because the trick would be if it's
Too much.
like I read the whole like journalistic correspondence, right? If it's like a press conference, yeah, that would really fit. If it's like a one-on-one interview, that's probably yeah. That's a good question. I think. Like, they're rushing hours or not.
So first one,
So probably, self-con, I don't know.
One thing that's really important about what is your relationship? And then also like a doctor, just with friends, family members, like that's gonna shape how the goals and the way you study how to.
Would that be under?
Yeah, it has that variation. Like I wonder on conversation. Steve had that was part of the reality. Hours and rejected.
I guess we could move on to the next one.
what did you mention? I don't know if you wrote that down. I feel like, because, you know, I feel like we have interpersonal communication, so we like that. Areas, like, you know.
Relationships.
Take another minute to finish up.
Yes.
So why do we care about? How do we do it? Yeah. I think one thing to do with that is oftentimes, somebody needs to be on a thing. We want to know that. Think about how media is on that. Right. Go ahead and finish up. Have somebody who is ready to share some of the things that you went over. All right. Bit of a lull here. So let's talk about some of these types of communication, starting with the interpersonal communication group. Oh, yeah, no problem. We'll go back to you and go down to interpersonal. Yeah.
So we did examples like Zoom, FaceTime, on the phone, person. Yeah, anything online.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. What about some of the needs and challenges?
Some of the needs, but sense of belonging, fulfilling needs, communication, urgent needs. And then for the third one, the anxiety, relationships, coming to a solution, and clear communication.
Yeah, so reaching a solution with another person can happen through that exchange. Oftentimes, where we end in a conversation is not what we expect or where we thought it was going to go, right? We talk to a friend, all of a sudden they're sharing something really personal with us, right? The way that a conversation can change through feedback is a really big thing that distinguishes interpersonal communication. But up here.
So, making decisions are the preludes to interpersonal community, or talking with someone else. You got to make decisions of what you're going to talk to them about, or when you're writing a text message, and consequences as well. Like it helps you decide whether your conscience.
Yeah. Right, so interpersonal communication is doing that front work that might inform preparing for talking to somebody else or talking to a group. How about group communication?
I said, or we said bring the friend, and a group text, in the classroom like we work. And everyone needs to be heard in the conversation. And then there's ideas that will bounce off each other. And then the challenges are there would be more ideas to sort through. And then talking over each other can happen. And then some people might not be comfortable with the other people.
Yeah, right. So this activity is an example of a freebie, right? Group communication. Not all of us enjoy working in groups because we might not be aligned in the habits and tasks and things that we do in that group, but we do learn a lot from each other and we're able to collaborate when it works well, right? So group communication has some of those hiccups. Public.
So we have political speeches, press conferences, job meetings, and conferences. Some of the needs, gotta be more than 12 people. You gotta be able to convey a clear message and with a big group that can be challenging, which is also one of our challenges. And then some other ones are collecting that many people to actually speak to and the anxiety of getting a complaint that many people.
Yeah, we have a class called public speaking that addresses some of those things too. I like the example of the conference, the example of public speaking. And then lastly,
So we said we had mediated and we said new social media platforms and blogs.
yeah,
And then some of the needs that we are spreading info to large groups quickly. And some of the challenges are bias, less personal communication, not much feedback, like absent feedback, and not reaching correct audience.
yeah, right. So interpersonal communication has this direct feedback and back and forth between you and another person. But as you get further and further out, right, you get less and less feedback. It's harder to modulate your message to fit the needs of other people. So thank you for working on this activity. To wrap up for today, we talked about what interpersonal communication is, messages between two people, how we use symbols to communicate through semiotics, and this pyramid of different types of communication. We'll be talking about perception and how we can map out how we do communication every day for Friday's class. So please make sure to turn in your attendance activity for your group. Please make sure the names of all of the group members are on that sheet of paper. Once your group has that in, you're welcome to head out for the day. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I'll see you again for Friday.
Thanks for, a few minutes late, I got it. We're all in class, and everybody went together.
Yeah, and I mean, I know the room, classes and all that is in here, so appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, see ya.
Thank you.